All right. Hello. Here we are. Together again. You have chosen to listen. Thank you very much for that. My name is Jay Brown, and this is my Yoga Talks podcast. I want to welcome you. Appreciate that you are tuning in today. On the podcast, I am speaking with Peter Blackaby today. Someone reached out to me a while back, sent me an email saying, there's a guy in the UK named Peter Blackaby. You really need to talk to him and bring him on your podcast. I took a look. I said, oh, he seems interesting, and put his name on a list and kind of forgot about it. And then I heard that he was coming into town to do a symposium with Leslie Kaminoff and Amy Matthews called Beyond Anatomy. It's happening at the Breathing Project in New York City on April 1st. And when I heard that, I said, oh, wow, very cool. Let me do a podcast with him when he comes into town. And then they said, well, can you do the podcast before he comes into town so we can also let people know about the symposium? And I said, of course. So we did this phone call, and it was great. Now, we totally ran into some technical difficulties. We struggled to even make it happen. We finally did with like a plan C setup, and it's good. You can hear you can hear us fine. There's a couple little audio aspects that aren't ideal, but it's worth it. It's a really great conversation on many levels. I don't know if you read my blog post this week. A lot of people responded to it. I think this conversation is a good follow-up to that in terms of how we think about our bodies and our anatomy and how that changes how we are in our bodies and in the world. And, you know, I did my best to hold my own in this conversation with Peter, but by the time we were done, I definitely felt like there's no otherbody else I'd rather hear talk to him than Leslie Kaminoff and Amy Matthews. I think they're both better equipped to hold down an anatomy talk than me. So I think this is a nice beginning of something. At least it was for me. I want to really encourage everybody to go to the Breathing Project on April 1st and hang out with these three people because they are some pretty brilliant minds. In fact, I saw Amy today. I mentioned to her this talk and something that we had spoken about in the talk, and she was like, ooh, that's something I kind of want to push back on. And I thought, oh, that's cool. Like whenever really smart, knowledgeable, wise people get together and push back on each other's ideas, that's when some pretty awesome learning tends to happen for everybody in the room. So I'm going to be there, and I would encourage everybody else to be there. Beyond Anatomy on April 1st. There'll be a link. Before we get to that talk, I do got to give you the update, right? Anybody who's been listening for the last couple weeks, I didn't get the mortgage. I didn't get it. And I wasn't surprised, you know. I knew that I didn't qualify, but that loan officer, I mentioned her last week, Jenny, I was like, all love to Jenny, thanks for being so helpful. But she was misinformed. She did not have the full story, and she made me think that I stood a chance when I didn't. We weren't able to work out a cosigner, so we've moved to plan B. We'll be renting, and it's fine. Actually, in certain ways, it's like a load off, you know, to not be taking on all that debt. But it did bring home what I was saying last week, that there's choices that you make when you choose yoga as the thing that you do without there being other backup plans, you know. And I remember kind of the moment. I've talked about like taking this trip to India in 1998, and when I got back, there was a moment in my head, I remember it clearly, where I knew, and I was like, if I go down this road, if I choose to make being a yoga teacher like my main jam, it's probably going to mean that I'm not going to have some of the potential, I don't know, securities or not securities, just like I'm going to be choosing a life that might mean hardships that other people don't deal with because they are playing more within conventional frameworks. I thought either I'm going to do that, I'm just going to choose to go down this uncharted territory, or I go buy some new clothes and try to get a real job. That was the choice. And I thought, nah, I'm going to go all in on this yoga thing. And so now here it is. You know, it's 20 years later and I don't qualify for a mortgage. What are you going to do? It's just how it goes. But really, I mentioned first when I spoke of this that if I didn't get it, I was going to feel like a failure. And I don't. I didn't feel like a failure when I heard it. I don't feel like a failure now. I do feel, I think, a lot of anxiety about my future right now. Just like a lot of uncertainty in ways I haven't been facing in a long time, or maybe ever. And I've mentioned this in the past, these looming choices I got to make, and I was going to avoid making the choices I need to make until they need to be made. Well, I think I've pretty much hit that limit. Like, in the next day or two, I've got to like really decide. I've already decided that I have to move out of Brooklyn, but I'm not planning to move that far away. But what's going to happen with the center? I can go either way with it, and that choice has to be made like in the next day or so. Okay, well, that can't be solved right now. So I'm just going to set that aside. And what I want to do is move on to some other cool things that are happening. Actually, I've got a new project I'm working on that I want to tell you about. You know, I put out these videos, practice videos, a couple years back. And then last year we put out this online workshop. And they've gone great. Me and my producer, Josh Citron, we developed like some pretty cool ways of creating video and delivering it in a DIY way for very little money and good quality. And so we ended up getting into conversation with an old friend of mine. Her name is Beth Donnelly Caban. And anybody who's listening to this who is maybe a yoga teacher who's been involved in prenatal yoga, or anybody who been to the Integral Yoga Institute might know Beth Donnelly Caban. She's trained a lot of prenatal yoga teachers. She was a prenatal yoga teacher to my wife when she was pregnant with our first child. And we went to her childbirth education course, which I'll never forget and was profoundly helpful. And I feel a lot of deep gratitude for her for educating me and helping me be more informed about how to support my wife when we were giving birth. Well, I've co-produced with Josh and Beth a prenatal yoga video. The Essential Prenatal Yoga Video with Beth Donnelly Caban. And it's pretty great. I mean, I've never been with child myself, so I can't speak from direct experience, but I can attest to just the wisdom and knowledge of Beth, who's not only a trained prenatal yoga teacher, but she's also a registered nurse and a midwife, and she knows what she's doing. And we created a video together that's going to be coming out. I'll let you guys know more about it, but I'm very excited about it. She's going to come on the podcast to talk about it too. So you can look for that prenatal yoga video with Beth Donnelly Caban. in co-production with J Brown Yoga Video. How about that? Pretty cool, you guys. Other than that, let me just plug my events. I am going to be in West Hartford, Connecticut on April 30th. I am going to be in Montana at the Feathered Pipe Ranch, June 17th through the 24th. And you know what? They sent me an email with like a list. Oh, yeah, here it is. Look at this. I want to give some shout outs. Who's coming to Montana with me? Leanne Churchill is coming from Canada, and Lisa McGalliard's coming from Florida, and Kathy Merrill's coming from Washington, and Noreen is coming from California, and Sam Russell's coming from the UK, and Leanne Shannon is coming from where it doesn't say, but Leanne's coming, and Zane Williams coming from Madison, Wisconsin. Very cool, you guys. Thanks for signing up. I am really excited about that trip to Montana in June, and I am looking forward to meeting you guys. If you have any particular requests or anything you're really hoping that we could work on, don't hesitate to send me an email. And everybody else listening, if you can make it happen, June 17th through 24th, Feathered Pipe Ranch, you can find out about those events and some others that are happening in the future that I'm not bothering to mention right now. You can read the archives of the blog and listen to the archives of this podcast and find those video offerings I was mentioning at jbrownyoga.com. Okay, let's get to it already. Let's spend some time with Peter Blackaby.
Can you get this? Is this all right?
Yeah, I think we're good to go. How about that?
Okay.
We
Lovely.
made it happen.
Finally, half an hour later.
Oh, gosh. Sorry, hopefully it's not too late for you.
No, don't worry. That's
okay.
Cool.
You would have been up.
I would have been up, yeah.
Okay, good. Well, Peter, I'm glad to finally get this chance to talk with you. We had some mutual friends. Actually, somebody reached out to me like a while back, like a couple months back, just a listener of the podcast, and she mentioned you as a suggestion. She said, "Oh, you got to get Peter on your show." And I think we might have even had a little bit of an exchange, but it was before I realized that you were doing the symposium with Amy and Leslie.
Yeah, nice. Yeah, I'm looking forward to that. It's an interesting project. I like what they're doing. Yeah.
Yeah, well, I've known them for a long time, and we'll definitely get to that project. But first, just in getting ready to talk to you, first of all, I saw like the podcast that you did for Liberated Body.
Oh yeah.
And so I was like, oh, this will be great. We're on the same page with stuff. This will be an easy conversation. And I'm sure it will. Yeah. So I went to your site, and the first thing that kind of stuck out to me, which kind of shocked me, because you had talked about how you had gone from this very physical view of yoga to something that, encompassing, as you put it, the complex relationships between things.
Yeah.
And yet when I went to your website, it said asana yoga teacher.
All right.
And I thought, oh, that seemed like a little bit of maybe some kind of contradiction or something. Because a lot of times when people say I teach asana, like I wrote a post about this, they're sort of talking about, oh, I don't teach anything but the poses.
Right.
But I'm assuming that you don't mean that.
I don't mean that. No. I guess it's how we do semantics. What do we mean by asana? What I mean is I'm doing things with the body. I'm not sitting meditating. I'm working with the body. That's really what I'm talking about. Not that I'm doing conventional classical asana. That's not what I mean.
But you still use the word asana. So what do you define an asana as?
Anything that can help us inform ourselves about ourselves, I think is what I would say. I mean, it may be that I'll change the word at some point. It's not something I've really thought much about. When people ask me what I do, I think I'm differentiating myself from I don't know, a mindfulness teacher, a meditation teacher, a Sanskrit scholar. So I'm just differentiating myself on that basis. And, I use a few asanas that I think we're all familiar with, things like dog. But I'm not,
Right.
it's not a big deal for me.
Yeah, no, I don't mean to give you like a hard
No,
time or
sorry.
anything. It's just something I'm really something I'm like curious about because I wrote this piece recently called I Teach Yoga, and it was kind of about that. Like a lot of people aren't are getting away from using like the word yoga or asana and just saying movement. But
Okay.
I'm still using yoga and you're still using asana, so that's kind of what I'm curious about.
Sure. I mean, I definitely want to use the term yoga. I don't want to. I mean, it's a question that comes up a lot, I guess, from people who've moved away from the classical asanas. Are you still teaching yoga? Is something that I get asked a lot. But how do you still call this yoga? And I do because I don't think that yoga is limited to a shape in space. It doesn't make sense. So
Hmm.
it's the intention we have behind what we're doing for me that is significant. Um, and I call anything yoga if it's about inquiry, self-discovery, connection, those kind of things.
Hmm.
And that's what I do.
Yeah, I'm in agreement. I mean, I think of it in those kind of terms, and I guess there's a lot of threads these days where people they're defining yoga in more narrow terms than that.
Yeah. I mean, it's always dodgy territory, isn't it, when someone asks you, what is yoga? I mean, you get a million different answers. And I think
Well,
yeah,
well, I was just going to say I didn't ask you that. I asked you what do you think asana
it's
is,
a good question.
which I was hoping for it to be like less crazy of the typical yoga question, you know. But it struck me because again, like some people really do think of the word asana as being referring specifically to just physicality, and
Okay.
you and I both are thinking of it as more than that.
Absolutely. It's very important to me that yoga comes off the mat. It's not exercise. It's something I often say to people that I don't teach exercise. This is a very limited way of thinking about the body. And then you have to start explaining, well, what are you doing if you're not doing exercise? And then it gets interesting, of course. That's when all the questions come up. I guess I've used asana, and it's a good question to ask me because I've not really bothered to refine that in my thinking. Should I, Jay?
Well,
And
it
now I
says
am.
asana yoga teacher. It says asana yoga teacher, and I was
Does
like,
it
oh, that's
really?
an
Well,
interesting choice.
yeah. I couldn't have just said yoga teacher. Maybe I'll remove asana. I don't know.
Well, I like that. It's definitely websites are always a work in progress as
Sure.
well.
Yeah.
Well, I'm happy to let you off of the hook there and kind of move on because I
Sure.
know that you did start out as from a different place. I know that you're studying as an osteopath and an Iyengar yoga teacher. Is that right?
Yeah, I was yoga before osteopathy. So my
Okay.
routine was Iyengar yoga. That's where I started. Well, I started doing yoga from books, but my first sort of serious inquiry into yoga was Iyengar, and I've been doing that several years before I decided to train as an osteopath. So they were two kind of systems that went side by side for some years. And in a way, they bumped into each other. They didn't support each other, so
Hmm.
it created a lot of interesting questions.
So, what was first of all? Where did you first study Iyengar yoga, and who was it with?
Uh, well, it was a woman called Eileen White who won't be on anybody's map. Um, she was teaching in a village that I lived in, and she had trained in Iyengar yoga. She was I went to a class in a adult education class in a village hall somewhere in a small village in Sussex. And that's where I
Huh.
started, and because perhaps I put a little more background to it. I wasn't a very physical orientated bloke. As a young man, I was dyspraxic. I didn't move very easily. Wasn't good at sport. But I was kind of hippie, and that's what drove me towards yoga. Wasn't really looking for asana work. I was looking for magic, and
Ah,
that's not what I.
you were looking for mind
Yeah,
expansion.
yeah. drugs and mind expansion and that kind of stuff.
Ah,
Yeah,
cool. That's what I'm trying to get to. I'm trying
yeah,
to get to the dirt.
yeah,
No, I'm all right. So now it's a clearer picture. You're a little bit hippie
yeah,
minded, and so you check out the local yoga class, which happens to be with this woman Eileen, who's an Iyengar teacher.
yeah.
And how old are you when that happens?
24.
24.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's like right around the time when I started too,
Okay.
which makes sense. You're sort of trying to figure out. At least I was. I don't know what you were trying to do, but I was trying to figure out like who the hell am I going to be and where am I? What am I going to do?
Yeah, all that stuff. Yeah, I was very much informed by a friend of mine. He left school, did the hippie thing, and went to India. And he was a very interesting guy. He spent time with the Kampati yogis in the Himalayas, and came back with all these kind of magical tales of yoga in India. And I wasn't as brave as him, so I went just down to my village hall.
Well, see, that's still pretty brave.
It was at the time. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. So, okay. So, how long you were doing that for a while? Like, when does it become something that's really like a regular thing? Do you get more serious about practice, or is it just going to this class once a week?
Well, I started off going to the class once a week, but it was one of the first physical things that I found that I was reasonably good at. I could do it. It wasn't like dance where I had to organize my body in a particular orientation. I was never good at that. And it wasn't sort of strength or training and that kind of stuff. I wasn't very good at that. But the posture
Mm-hmm.
work, I somehow got a handle on, and I liked the idea. Perhaps at the time I needed a bit of discipline, and
Mm-hmm.
it gave me that. It gave me kind of something to hang on to, and my life, wasn't that great at that time, and I think it
Mm-hmm.
helped straighten me out. It was good from that point of view. I liked the teacher. She encouraged us. She said sort of good things would happen if we practiced, and to start with, they did. Good things happened.
Well, I had a similar experience. For me, I lacked discipline,
Yeah,
and yoga practice like Ashtanga Vinyasa and Iyengar yoga both really did provide me
yeah,
that.
yeah,
And that was definitely a positive thing, but
yeah.
it kind of went south for me at a certain point in terms of injuring myself.
Sure.
And so okay, so you said you weren't like that. You weren't that body oriented as a kid, but for some reason you were able to get into the poses.
I guess I wasn't. I'm not very flexible, but it probably out of all the kind of things I had, flexibility was something I was slightly more at.
Uh
And
huh.
so I could sit on the floor quite easily. I could.
Yeah, no, I had that too. I was like more of like a drama kid than like a sport guy because I was like long and thin,
Yeah, me
and
too.
that
Yeah,
wasn't good for football, but
sure.
it's great for yoga,
Yeah,
right?
exactly. Yeah. So, it was the first thing physically I was any good at. So I kind of stuck at it. And because I stuck at it, I got better at it, and I got into it, in a rather rigorous and slightly obsessive way, and practiced very hard.
Hmm.
So you make a bit of progress, in the sense that you can do more postures.
You could get those. You could make the alignment
You
happen.
can, yeah, exactly. And you get some satisfaction from that. Yeah, and
Yeah, absolutely. There's actually I don't think that's necessarily bad. Like you set goals and you accomplish
yeah.
them and you feel like you're progressing along. But all right, so when did you decide to study osteopathy? Like when does that come into the picture?
Well, at the time I was a carpenter. I used
What's that? I'm sorry, say that again. You were a carpenter?
carpenter, yeah, and I used
Okay.
to restore furniture. I ran a business. I used to employ people, and then we hit a recession. Business got difficult. I could see the business going down the pan, and I wasn't quite really sure what to do. And when I was thinking about it, osteopathy came up as an option, and it just seemed exactly what I was interested in because by that time I was just starting to train as a Iyengar teacher, which is what I did, and osteopathy seemed like a perfect bedfellow. And
Mm-hmm.
so I looked around and I found particularly a part-time course in the UK because I couldn't study full-time because I had a mortgage and that kind of stuff. So
Mm-hmm.
the part-time course was the best thing I could find, but it went on for 2 years longer than a full-time course. But it was good. It was very intense, trying to run a business that was going down the pan and train to be a yoga teacher and study osteopathy was an intense period. But I really enjoyed it. And I loved osteopathy. I loved the study of anatomy. I got very into anatomy. I studied it very hard. Enjoyed the work. It informed my yoga in a, at the time, what I thought was a really useful way. And I now don't think it was a very useful way, but that was the process back in the sort of late 80s, early 90s. I built my reputation in the UK as being an anatomical yoga teacher, and I would travel around the country with a suitcase full of bones and skeletons and tell people about their muscles and joints, and it went down very well.
I know. Well, that takes me back because I know back then it was before there was like the proliferation of 200-hour yoga teacher trainings.
Sure.
And Iyengar yoga was this gold standard. You had to go for years.
Yeah.
I remember like you weren't allowed to go to the level 2 class
Yeah.
until you could show that you did all the poses right from level 1.
Yeah.
And I was kind of very turned off by that, but you just definitely could like jump through hoops and like make your way up the ladder.
Yeah.
And at some point, like more anatomical information was what took you to like the higher echelons, right?
Yeah.
Because you could more like articulate the microtonal aspects of the body that are happening in the poses, right?
Well, that's how it should have been. But what actually happened was because I was studying osteopathy, so my anatomy was getting way ahead of my peers, and every time I tried to bring some of my osteopathic understanding into a class and talk about it, it just wasn't received very well because it wasn't what Iyengar said, or it wasn't what so it didn't conform. And that was the first kind of conflict that I kind of experienced in yoga, that some of the stuff I was learning as an osteopath didn't marry with my understanding as my Iyengar teacher. And created a lot of difficulty at the time. And, that's when I started to move away from Iyengar.
And you were already like teaching Iyengar yoga.
Yeah, I was.
So, I mean, I had that happen too. Like I was like a power vinyasa teacher, and then I kind of had come to some epiphanies about the fact that I thought I was hurting myself, and made a change. But I remember having to make that shift, and all the students who knew me as teaching one thing, and then now I was doing something different.
Yeah.
That was like a kind of difficult shift. So you had to make that shift too.
Yeah, very difficult. Yeah, because you're in the wilderness for a while. Because at the time there was no real alternative. If you weren't Iyengar, you were a heretic if you weren't teaching, the script. But I don't know. I don't think you have this over there in the States so much. But the person who helped me turn it around, there were two people really. A guy called John Stirk, you may have heard of. He's an interesting bloke, and he's quite a big name over here in the UK. You should interview him one day.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. I just wrote his name down.
Yeah.
You said John. What was his last name?
Stirk. He's got a book called The Original Body. You can Google that.
Cool.
And he'd been working with a teacher called Mary Stewart, who had been working with a woman called Vanda Scaravelli. And
I know her from readings and whatnot, but she's not as well known around here as I think she is over there.
Yeah, big in Europe, very big in Europe. So because she worked from Italy, and a lot of teachers from the UK went over there. And she had been working with Iyengar, Desikachar, and Krishnamurti, and had very much reformed the way. I mean, the story goes, as far as I understand it, and a lot of people understand it better than this, but as I understand it, she was very good friends with Krishnamurti, and he was quite a frail man. And she realized that the Iyengar way of working was actually too strong for him and hurt him. And so she stopped working with Iyengar and Desikachar and started working with Krishnamurti, who was a pretty anti-guru guru.
Yes.
I'm sure you know.
Well, I had Eric Schiffman on, and he
Okay.
studied over there at his school for a while, so we learned about him some. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
And he told me that when he went there to school, they were teaching Desikachar yoga. That all the yoga classes were Desikachar yoga.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, he's around, but what Scaravelli did was really rearrange the asanas in what she would call a body-friendly way. I mean, she wasn't an anatomist or anything like that. She was a musician. And she did a lot of, I mean, the three things that I think she said that I think were important. And one was notice what happens when you practice, notice your relationship to gravity, and notice what happens when you breathe. And that was about it, you know.
Yeah.
And that gives you quite a lot of freedom.
Yeah.
And so the teacher I worked with then, Mary Stewart, who was an ex-Iyengar teacher, but she had been studying with Vanda, and she really changed my perspective. I went up to London to work with her for a few summers, and one of the because I was this kind of hotshot Iyengar teacher, and yeah, and I went to her class, and it was full of ladies in their 60s, 70s. You know, I was in my late 30s by this time. And they were doing great yoga. You know, they were, I remember particularly an 80-year-old woman who had broken her wrist and was just starting to do handstands again. And in a very gentle way, you know, and that struck me. And all Mary used to ever say to me was, "Can you do less, Peter? Can you do less?"
Yeah.
You know?
Yes. Wow. Well, that's interesting to me though, because you said would she tell you like where to put your feet in something? Like how much would she tell you, and how much was just free exploration?
Well, in those days, there was still quite a lot of telling. So she was
Yeah.
still quite prescriptive. But
Yeah.
the thing that changed was, you know, with Iyengar, it was always how hard were you working? You know, one of his sort of messages was every cell of your body should be working.
Right, like you start from 100%.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah.
And what Mary was constantly trying to get me to do was subtract. You know, what could I take away? What could I take away? And still, and I felt very dispossessed of, you know, I felt confounded by all that. I didn't know what to do. You know? I felt humiliated actually, because she would pick me out often she didn't mean to humiliate me at all. It was just because I had a bit of an ego, and suddenly finding myself being unable to fathom what she was on about for some time. And yet all these people were doing lovely yoga around me. So it kept me going back.
Well, I had a similar experience when, for a long time, my practice was always about seeing how far I could go.
Yeah.
It was always about seeing how far I could go. So the idea of having a practice that wasn't about that left me at a loss as to what to do.
Exactly. Yeah.
And I heard you say that it was at one point, it was work as hard as you can.
Yeah.
And then later it was like do as little as possible.
Yeah.
And I had the same thing. I always think of that as kind of finding a new subtlety to my practice. You know, that it just opened up other possibilities for what I was doing with it and what I was getting from it, other than just seeing if I can take my body farther in this shape.
It has a lot more potential for questions and answers, and you know, interaction and thinking about it when you start subtracting. Leads you down very interesting thought processes.
Okay, my other question is, in your work with Mary Stewart, what kind of stuff did she do around the breath?
Very traditional, really. I mean, Kapalabhati, the bandhas, some alternate nostril breathing. She was only a step away from Iyengar, really. You know,
I see.
It wasn't radical, you know, but it was for me.
Yeah, no.
It was. I mean, it was a bridge that really helped me. And the other thing that was really interesting about her, and this is, you know, I'm always deeply thankful for her about this, is that she always tried to answer questions. So, and she was the first yoga teacher I had, you know, that attempted to give you reasonable answers to questions. Whereas within the system at the time I was studying Iyengar, that it was always, well, keep practicing, you'll find out.
Right. So there wasn't like an interpersonal engagement where you could like have queries and they would engage you in that kind of dialogue.
Iyengar yoga at the time, and I'm stressing that time, it might have changed now, you didn't ask questions. It wasn't encouraged. So, you were left very much to follow the rule book and ask advice from people who had been to Pune or been working with, the people who have been working with Iyengar. So that's where you got your information from, not from your own inquiry.
Yeah.
And that was a freedom Mary gave me, that you can ask questions, you can inquire, you can come up with your own answers.
Nice.
And that was really nice, yeah.
Yeah, and then you had to figure out what to do with that.
Absolutely, yeah, exactly. And at the time, because I was an osteopath, all the answers were anatomical. So at the time, I was looking at how muscle group. I bought an electromyograph, and look.
What's that? I don't know what that is. You got to tell me what that is.
It's a little machine.
What's an electromyograph?
It measures the activity of muscles. So you can put it on your skin, and you can find out which muscles are working and how hard they're working. And
okay, so it's like a biofeedback machine, so you could tell what's engaging or something.
Yeah, you could. You could use it for biofeedback, but it was kind of a medical machine to find out really whether muscles worked or not. You could use it on people who, had neural damage or had stroke where their muscles engaged. Could they work them? And I would practice my yoga with these electrodes stuck all over my body to find out which muscles did what.
Wow, that's amazing. So you hooked yourself up to probes to sort of figure out what was engaging.
Yeah, exactly. So it seemed really a good idea at the time.
I think it's an amazing idea. All right. So at some point, you mentioned somebody else in that other talk I heard you give, somebody I hadn't heard of.
Okay.
I think his name was Serge Krakovetsky. Who's that?
Serge Krakovetsky.
Yeah. Say that again.
Serge Krakovetsky. He's a Canadian.
Okay. Tell me something about him. How did you come to him? Was that sometime? I'm assuming that's after Barry blew your mind.
Yeah. He came in through the osteopathic world. He's not a yoga person at all. He's actually used to be an aeronautical engineer.
Go figure.
Yeah. But for one reason or another, and it's he came into my kind of sphere of reference when I went to a lecture of his. This is after I'd finished towards the end of my osteopathic training. And you're studying anatomy all the time. You study anatomy in ridiculous detail. You're looking at the facet joints and the angles of them. You're looking at all the brachial plexus. You're learning nerve pathways. You learn anatomy in a fantastic amount of detail that would be very useful if you're going to be a surgeon. But no one ever really, and I didn't realize it at the time, but no one really put it together in a functional way. And when I first...
If you are hearing this message, then you're listening to the free version of J. Brown Yoga Talks. To hear the rest of our conversation, please subscribe to Podcast Premium at jbrownyoga.com/premium.